Welcome to this explainer. I'm so glad you're here. If you've ever tried keeping up with international climate news, you've probably felt like you're drowning in a total alphabet soup. UNFCCC, IPCC, NDCs, COP28, it honestly feels like a completely different language, right? Well, today, we are going to demystify the whole shebang. We're breaking down this massive network of global climate action into a clear, understandable architecture. Let's just jump right in.
To make sense of this giant global bureaucracy, we're going to look at the architecture of action, grouped into 4 clear steps: measuring the climate crisis, decades of global treaties, funding the climate fight, and finally, pathways to a green economy. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Measuring the climate crisis, the foundation. Because, before the world can coordinate any kind of real action, it first has to accurately measure the scale of the problem. You just can't manage what you don't measure.
Okay, think about this simple but absolutely staggering number, 1.5. This comes from the Global Footprint Network, which maps out our consumption of natural resources. They measure our ecological footprint, basically human demand on Earth's ecosystems. Right now, humanity's total ecological footprint is sitting at 1.5 planet Earths, meaning we are burning through ecological services 1.5 times as fast as the Earth can actually renew them. We're heavily overdrawing our planetary bank account. And guys, Mother Nature charges some pretty brutal overdraft fees.
A massive chunk of that ecological footprint is our carbon footprint. Now, we hear this buzzword all the time, but the precise definition really matters here. It's not just some abstract measure of gas floating up in the air. It is physically defined as the amount of productive land and sea area required to sequester, or just absorb, the carbon dioxide released from burning fossil fuels. It literally shows us the physical, geographical demand our fossil fuel addiction places on the Earth.
So who actually gives the world the scientific consensus on all of this? That brings us to our very first major acronym, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Set up way back in December 1988 by the UN Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, this group sits in Geneva and has 195 member countries. Their main job? Preparing these massive, comprehensive assessment reports on climate science. They basically hand governments all over the globe a clear, unified, scientific playbook of exactly what is happening to our climate.
And to actually get that data, we rely on some pretty essential measurement tools, like the NGGIP, which was established by the IPCC. This program gives countries the exact methods they need to estimate and report their greenhouse gas emissions to the UN. Complementing that is TEEB, which stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Launched in 2007 by Germany and the European Commission, and led by Pavan Sukhdev, TEEB measures something crucial: the massive economic cost of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. It literally puts a financial price tag on nature's decline.
Section 2. Decades of Global Treaties, the Framework. This is where all that science we just measured actually gets turned into international law.
Looking back over the last 30 years, the whole thing really kicked off in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, which created the UNFCCC, the foundational UN Treaty on Climate Change. Fast forward to 1997 and we get the Kyoto Protocol. Then in 2007, a really huge evolutionary shift happens at the Bali meet. This was a game changer because the conversation totally expanded. The world recognized that rapidly growing developing nations like India and China would eventually need to make emission cuts too. That realization completely overhauled global expectations, which eventually led to the famous 2015 Paris Agreement and most recently COP28 over in Dubai in 2023.
Now, what's super fascinating about these early milestones is the massive shift in global attitude. Just look at the difference between the 1992 UNFCCC and the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. The 1992 convention merely encouraged industrialized countries to stabilize their greenhouse gas emissions. Kind of a gentle nudge, right? But by 1995, everybody realized encouragement just wasn't cutting it. So the Kyoto Protocol stepped in and actually committed them to do so. That was the legal instrument that took the 1992 convention and gave it some real teeth.
And that brings us to the modern era and the 2015 Paris Agreement. The real core engine of Paris is something called NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions. So instead of some top-down mandate, the agreement requires all 195 parties to step up and put forward their own best efforts to report and reduce emissions. The shared, highly ambitious goal here is to hold the global average temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while actively pursuing efforts to keep it to just 1.5 degrees
So how are we actually doing on those goals? Well, late in 2023, the world gathered in Dubai for COP28. This was a huge milestone because it marked the first global stocktake, basically a moment for the whole world to look in the mirror, check its progress, and seriously ratchet up climate ambition before the end of the decade. But maybe even more importantly, COP28 finalized the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. This is a completely new structure with its own independent secretariat designed specifically to help vulnerable nations.
But of course, treaties are pretty much just pieces of paper if there's no money behind them, right? So let's move on to Section 3, Funding the Climate Fight, the utilities.
This number right here really illustrates the scale we're talking about, $700 million. Since the decision at COP28 to finalize that loss and damage fund I just mentioned, this amount has been pledged by countries like the UAE, Germany, the UK, the European Union, and Japan. The whole point of this money is to assist developing countries that are super vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, helping them bounce back from extreme weather events. Now, $700 million sounds like a massive victory, and it is, but experts estimate the actual damages are well into the hundreds of billions annually. So really, this is just a foundational first step.
That $700 million, though, is just one small piece of a much larger global climate finance architecture. This whole system is administered primarily by the World Bank and is channeled through multilateral funds like the Global Environment Facility. It also includes older established mechanisms like the Special Climate Change Fund, or SCCF, which was set up way back in 2001 to finance adaptation and technology transfer. On top of that, it's supported by the Santiago Network, which provides critical technical assistance and is hosted by a joint consortium of UN agencies. It's a massive, interconnected web.
To give you a sense of how these things actually operate, let's compare two major regional initiatives administered by the European Commission, both of which became operational in 2008. First, you have the Global Climate Change Alliance, which focuses pretty broadly on adaptation and mitigation. But then look at the second one, GEREF, the Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Fund. What makes GEREF so unique is its structure. It was set up as a public-private partnership, meaning it actively blends public funds with private investments to drive general mitigation efforts. It's a really clever way to multiply impact.
Okay, moving on to our final step. Section 4, Pathways to a Green Economy, the Solutions. This is where we get into the actual operational strategies happening on the ground to combat the crisis.
We hear the term green economy constantly, right? But what does it actually mean? Interestingly enough, the Rio +20 outcome document noted that it actually lacks a single universal definition. Basically, it's a sustainable economic system driven by investments that reduce carbon emissions and prevent biodiversity loss. But the catch is, it must adapt to national circumstances. Take India, for example. They view the green economy explicitly through the lens of inclusive economic growth and poverty eradication. It's fundamentally about targeting the deeply rooted systemic causes of unsustainable development.
A perfect example of how these global solutions have matured is the evolution of forestry strategies. Originally, there was REDD, which was really just about creating incentives to check and reduce deforestation. It was a pretty defensive posture, trying to stop the bleeding. But then we get REDD+, which brilliantly illustrates a shift to a much more proactive strategy. It goes way further by adding a whole flow of positive incentives for conservation, for sustainable management, and for actually enhancing the quality and expanse of forest carbon stocks. It's not just about doing less harm, it's about doing more good.
And of course, we absolutely have to talk about agriculture, which directly accounts for about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, that absolutely includes all those cows burping methane. Agriculture is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, but it's also a major driver of it. The good news? The solution here is something called climate-smart agriculture. When managed correctly, agriculture can actually sequester and absorb carbon straight back into the soil rather than emitting it. And research shows this can be done without sacrificing productivity or crop yields. Talk about a win-win. It literally turns a major polluter into a massive part of the solution.
So, we've covered the science, the treaties, the money, and the solutions. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a slightly provocative question. When is your Earth Overshoot Day? Earth Overshoot Day is the exact calendar date when our resource consumption for the entire year exceeds the Earth's capacity to regenerate those resources. Remember that 1.5 Earth statistic we talked about at the very beginning? That means the global overshoot day happens way before the year is actually over. So I challenge you to consider your own consumption timeline and think about how the global frameworks we explored today play a role in pushing that date further back into December. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.